Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're venturing into a really fascinating, maybe slightly unsettling area of human psychology,
Where we're talking about erotomania.
also known as de Clerambault's syndrome. We've pulled together quite a bit from psychiatric literature to, try and get a handle on this condition. It's relatively uncommon.
Yeah, uncommon but complex. Our mission here is really to understand its core features, look at the potential causes, what the thinking is there, and trace its history.
And the history part is immediately interesting. I mean, the sources mention connections going way back, Hippocrates even.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Right.
Thinking about what they might have observed back then that connects to what we now call erotomania.
So let's start with the basics. What is erotomania at its core?
Well, fundamentally, it's this absolute unshakable belief, a delusion.
Okay, a delusion that someone is in love with you.
Exactly. And crucially, that someone is often, of a higher social standing, maybe married, maybe famous, or just completely unattainable.
Someone who hasn't actually shown any interest.
Right. And the belief just doesn't break. It's completely resistant to evidence.
And it's not always a real living person they know, is it?
No, that's a key point from the sources.
Yeah.
The object of this delusion could be someone they've never met. It could be someone who's passed away, or sometimes even entirely imaginary.
Wow. Okay, so it's not just a really intense crush.
Not at all. It's a fixed, irrational belief that really warps their reality.
Which makes sense why, psychiatrically speaking, it falls under delusional disorders. The DSM-5 classifies it that way.
That's right. It's a subtype of delusional disorder. Not really its own separate category anymore, but a specific presentation.
So, serious break from, well, objective reality.
Definitely. And the way it starts, the literature often describes it as quite sudden, an abrupt onset.
Really? Disappears?
Often, yeah. But then, unfortunately, it tends to stick around. It's usually chronic, not something that just fades quickly.
Which raises questions about triggers, I guess. What makes it appear so suddenly and then last?
That's a central question. Now, demographically, there are some patterns noted, though we have to be careful.
Okay.
It seems to be diagnosed more often in women, often described in the literature as maybe shy, dependent, perhaps sexually inexperienced.
But not exclusively women.
Absolutely not. It's really important to stress that. One of the case reports we looked at involved a man. So it definitely occurs across genders. Stereotypes can be misleading here.
Good clarification. So, okay, this delusion is in place. How does it affect how the person sees the world? You mentioned delusions of reference.
Yes, this is one of the most fascinating and, frankly, kind of disturbing aspects. Delusions of reference mean the person starts interpreting random neutral things in their environment as being specifically about them.
As confirmation of the love?
Precisely. They see hidden messages, signs of affection, directed only at them from their supposed admirer.
How does that actually work? Like, what sort of things?
Oh, it could be anything. Seeing a certain sequence of numbers on a license plate, the way someone adjusts their posture, how items are arranged in a shop window, mundane things.
And they read deep personal meaning into it.
Exactly. They weave it into the narrative. It reinforces the delusion. It shows, this deep need for connection, however distorted it becomes.
Almost like living in a spy movie where everything's a coded message just for you.
Kind of, yeah. And if the object of the delusion is, say, a public figure,
A celebrity.
right, then they might interpret that person's social media posts, maybe their clothing choices on TV, even news reports about them, as secret communications.
It sounds incredibly elaborate.
It can be. The level of detail, the conviction, it's profound.
And the actual content of the delusion can go beyond just, they love me,
Yeah.
right? The sources mention more extreme beliefs.
Oh, absolutely. We see examples like beliefs about non-existent pregnancies, even phantom births, supposedly resulting from this secret relationship, or this overwhelming sense that their union is like divinely ordained, fated.
That really underscores the detachment from reality.
It does. It shows how powerful these fixed ideas can be.
Is the person they're fixated on always the same? Or can that change?
It can vary. Sometimes the focus shifts. The delusion might transfer from one person to another over time.
Interesting.
But in other cases, it becomes chronic and fixed on just one individual for years or even decades. Why it shifts or stays fixed? That's another complex question.
And throughout all this, there's this core element of denial. They just don't accept any contradictory information.
That's fundamental. Complete denial. You can present clear evidence the person is married. They've explicitly said they aren't interested. They live on another continent. None of it matters.
How do they process that evidence then?
They usually dismiss it outright. Or, quite often, they'll reinterpret it
Reinterpreted how?
as further proof, like, oh, they have to say they're not interested publicly to protect our secret love,
Hmm.
or their spouse is just part of the cover story. It feeds back into the delusion.
Wow, okay. So, this unshakable belief, fueled by misinterpretations. Now, you mentioned different forms, primary and secondary erotomania.
Right. The sources make this distinction. Primary erotomania is basically the condition existing on its own. It doesn't seem to be a symptom of something else.
And it has that sudden onset you mentioned.
Often, yes,
Hmm.
sudden onset tends to be chronic. And historically, it sometimes got lumped under this really unfortunate label, old maid's insanity.
Yikes. That definitely shows some historical bias.
Doesn't it? It tells you a lot about societal views at the time.
So that's primary. What about secondary?
Secondary erotomania pops up alongside other mental health conditions, most commonly things like paranoid schizophrenia.
Okay, so the erotomania is part of a bigger picture.
Exactly. In those cases, you often see the erotomanic delusion mixed in with other symptoms, maybe persecutory delusions, feeling conspired against, maybe hallucinations, grandiose ideas about oneself, and the onset is usually more gradual.
Part of the progression of the other illness.
Precise.
And does the severity vary? Is it always this intense, all-consuming thing?
No, there seems to be a spectrum. The sources talk about fixed conditions. Those are the more severe ones. Constant delusions, harder to treat, often seen in those individuals described as more timid or isolated.
And the milder forms?
Milder, maybe recurrent forms exist too. The delusions might be shorter-lived, come and go. These might actually go undetected for a long time because they're less disruptive outwardly.
But even in milder forms, or certainly in the fixed ones, these beliefs can lead to actions, right? Problematic behaviors.
Absolutely. That's often where the real-world problems arise. The belief that this person loves them can drive them to try and make contact constantly.
Like what kinds of things?
Excessive calls, texts, emails, unwanted letters, gifts showing up, persistent harassment online, maybe through social media.
Things that cross boundaries.
Definitely. And it can escalate. Unannounced visits to their home or workplace. Even trying to contact the person's family, friends, colleagues.
Which can easily move into stalking territory.
Sadly, yes. Stalking is a common and very serious outcome. It creates a really difficult, sometimes dangerous situation for the object of the delusion and ultimately for the individual experiencing erotomania too.
Okay, so that paints a clearer picture of what it looks like. Let's shift gears a bit and talk about causes. What do the sources suggest might be behind erotomania?
Well, as we touched on with primary versus secondary, it can be the main issue itself or it can be a symptom.
Right, a symptom of something like bipolar I disorder or schizophrenia.
Exactly. Making that distinction is really key for figuring out the approach, treatment-wise.
Are there specific triggers, things that might kickstart it?
The sources mention a few potential associations. Things like alcoholism or substance abuse, including cannabis, have been noted in some cases.
As potential triggers, not definite causes.
Correct. Yes,
Yeah.
just associations seen sometimes. Interestingly, even starting antidepressant medication has been suggested as a possible precipitating factor in some individuals.
That's surprising. What about genetics? Is there a family link?
There might be. The literature suggests that it's not uncommon to find a family history of other psychiatric disorders, or maybe dementia, among relatives of people with erotomania.
Suggesting some kind of underlying vulnerability, perhaps.
Possibly, yeah, a potential genetic predisposition.
Yeah.
It's an area still being researched.
And the sources also mention some behavioral overlaps with other conditions.
Yes. Intriguingly, some behavioral similarities have been noted with early onset Alzheimer's disease.
Really? Like what?
Things like mood swings, poor judgment, confusion, sometimes even hallucinations.
Not saying it is Alzheimer's, but
No, definitely not. But the overlap suggests maybe some shared brain pathways or vulnerabilities that could be worth exploring further.
okay. What about psychological explanations? Freud, I imagine, had something to say.
Oh, yes. Freud being Freud, he linked it to defense mechanisms. Specifically, he proposed it could be a defense against unconscious homosexual impulses.
How did that work in his theory?
It involved a whole process: paranoia denial, displacing feelings onto someone else, projecting them. Basically, a complex way to manage internal conflicts the person found unacceptable.
Classic psychoanalytic thinking. Are there other psychological angles?
Yes. Some theories suggest it might be a coping mechanism, albeit a maladaptive one.
Coping with what?
Maybe with extreme loneliness, or a big blow to self-esteem, perhaps after a major loss or rejection. The delusion of being loved fills a void, provides a sense of worth.
A kind of psychological crutch, but one that's detached from reality?
You could see it that way.
Yeah.
There's also been some speculation linking it to unmet needs around homosexuality or maybe narcissism, but those ideas are less developed, more theoretical.
So, several psychological theories trying to explain the why. What about the brain itself, neurologically?
There has been some research looking at brain structure. Some studies point towards possible subtle differences.
It's like what?
Things like maybe increased asymmetry in the temporal lobes or slightly larger lateral ventricles in the brain compared to control groups.
Suggesting an underlying neurological component.
Potentially, yes. But it's early days for that research, really. We need more work to understand if these differences are cause, effect, or just correlation, and what they actually mean functionally.
It's fascinating how you have these potential layers, psychological defenses, maybe neurological differences, perhaps genetic factors, all potentially playing a role.
It really highlights the complexity. It's likely not just one single cause.
Okay, let's step back and look at the history. You said this idea goes way back, but our understanding hasn't always been the same, has it?
Not at all. The definition has evolved dramatically over time. It's quite a journey.
So how was it seen initially? Classical times, say.
Back then, and up until around the early 18th century, it was often seen more broadly, like a general illness caused by unrequited love, much less specific than today.
Almost like lovesickness was considered a real ailment.
Pretty much, yeah. Not necessarily a mental disorder in our modern sense.
Then what happened in the 18th century?
Things shifted. From the early 18th to early 19th century, the term became more associated with excessive physical love, kind of closer to what we might think of as nymphomania or satyriasis today.
So it went from unrequited love to excessive love.
Right, reflecting the changing social and moral focus of the time, perhaps.
When did the idea of unrequited love itself being a mental illness start to take shape?
That really emerged in the 19th century and carried into the early 20th. That's when you start seeing intense, one-sided love framed more as a potential pathology, a form of mental disease.
A more medicalized view.
Exactly. And then from the early 20th century onwards, the definition really crystallizes around what we understand today. The core delusional belief of being loved by someone else.
Which is the declarambo definition, essentially.
Pretty much, yes. That refinement reflects decades of psychiatric observation and attempts at clearer diagnosis.
And there were key figures along the way. You mentioned Hippocrates.
Yes, and others in antiquity like Erastratus, Plutarch, Galen. Later, people like Bartholomew Pardieu, Jacques Ferrand. He wrote Maladie d'amour ou mélancolie érotique, disease of love or erotic melancholy.
Catchy title.
Isn't it? Then came terms like erotic paranoia, erotic self-referent delusion before erotomania stuck. And in the 20th century, of course, Declarembo was huge.
Giving his name to the syndrome.
Right. And M.V. Seaman, who coined terms like phantom lover syndrome. Plus, major figures in psychiatry like Kraepelin, Bernard, Winokur, Kemmler, Monroe. They all contributed pieces to the puzzle.
Declarambo's contribution seems central, though. What was so key about his work?
He provided really detailed, systematic clinical descriptions. He pinned down the core features, the delusional belief, the associated behaviors, in a way that hadn't really been done before. It laid a foundation.
And he documented specific cases. I think the sources mentioned one involving British royalty.
Yes, a famous one. He described a patient absolutely convinced that King George V was secretly in love with her.
King George V. Wow.
Yeah. And she would apparently stand outside Buckingham Palace, interpreting movements of the curtains in the windows as personal messages from him.
That perfectly illustrates the delusion of reference, doesn't it? Finding meaning in anything.
Exactly. It's a very vivid example of how the delusion shapes perception.
And sadly, there have been other, more public cases that brought this condition into the spotlight, often tragically.
Unfortunately, yes. The case of John Hinckley Jr. is probably one of the most well-known. His attempt on President Reagan's life was reportedly driven by his obsession with Jodie Foster.
Believing the act would impress her.
That was the reported motivation, stemming from an erotomanic fixation. It's a chilling example of the potential danger.
Truly disturbing. Any other cases mentioned?
The sources also bring up Margaret Mary Ray, who stalked David Letterman, and also astronaut Story Musgrave over many years.
Right, I remember that name.
And more recently, Michael David Barrett, who stalked sports reporter Aaron Andrews. These cases, while different, all show that persistent intrusive pattern driven by the delusion.
It's important to add the caveat here, though, that the sources make clear. Not all stalking is erotomania.
Absolutely crucial point. Stalking is a behavior with many possible underlying causes. Erotomania is one specific, relatively rare cause. You can't just equate the two. Proper diagnosis is vital.
Okay. So, given all this complexity, what about treatment? What do the sources say works or helps?
Well, the first thing is that there's no single magic bullet treatment. The consensus seems to be that it requires a really individualized approach, tailored to the person.
Makes sense. What about medications? Are drugs helpful?
They can be. Antipsychotics are the main pharmacological tool, both typical ones like Pimozide, which interestingly is also approved for Tourette's,
Okay.
and atypical antipsychotics like risperidone and clozapine. There's some suggestion Pimozide might be particularly effective for delusional disorders, but more research is always needed.
And if there's depression alongside it,
Then SSRIs, the common antidepressants, might be used to help manage those symptoms as well.
but it's not just about pills, presumably.
Oh, definitely not. Non-pharmacological approaches are key. Things like supportive psychotherapy can be very important.
Helping the person cope, build insight, maybe?
Exactly. And family therapy, working with the environment around the person. Sometimes practical things like rehousing might be necessary. Risk management is also a big component, especially if there's stalking behavior.
And if it's secondary erotomania.
Then treating the underlying condition, the schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, is paramount. You treat the root cause.
What about things like ECT, electroconvulsive therapy?
ECT is mentioned. It might provide temporary remission, a temporary reduction of the delusions in some cases. Not usually a long-term cure, but can be useful sometimes.
And psychosocial interventions, what does that involve?
That's about improving quality of life, social functioning, helping the person engage in positive activities, trying to adjust environmental factors, maybe finding ways to gently replace the focus on the delusion with other interests.
It sounds like a real multi-pronged effort is needed.
It usually is, especially for more troublesome cases. Neuroleptic medications, sometimes even enforced separation from the object of the delusion, might be necessary measures, although those are obviously serious steps.
Okay. So, wrapping this up, we've covered a lot.
Yeah.
From the core delusion of being loved to the different forms, the potential causes, biological, psychological, the fascinating history.
The troubling real-world cases and the current thinking on treatment, it's a really complex condition.
It definitely is. It touches on belief, reality, how our minds work.
Exactly. The intricate interplay of it all.
So maybe a final thought for you, our listener, to chew on. Thinking about how powerful belief can be and that fine line between, say, intense admiration and an actual delusion. What does erotomania tell us about our basic human need for connection, for validation?
Yeah, and maybe even what societal factors might subtly push someone towards finding that connection in such an intense, fixated way.
Lots to think about there. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.